It's been a little over a year since I've made my last video, and I think part of that is because of life's general busyness, which I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, but having a full-time job, a spouse, maintaining family and friend relationships, creative outlets, hobbies, travel, and the odd random life circumstance that sometimes gets thrown your way, it can be a bit overwhelming. But I think a huge chunk of the reason why I haven't made a video is because of perfectionism. I think it was preventing me from starting to begin with. And how can you fail if you don't start in the first place? And in fact, I even did it when trying to start recording this video. I spent 2 whole days making an intro title card and a coming up section, only to decide to scrap it in the end because it didn't feel authentic to my personal creative process, which is perhaps maybe why it took me so long to begin with. But one day, as a lover of Pinterest, I like to browse, and sometimes you come across things that reach through the screen and pull you in and try to send you a message and try to shake you awake. And one of those things was this quote that I came across that said, "Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact it's the thing that really is preventing us from being seen." And that quote really stuck with me. It was really profound because for a long time I assumed that perfectionism would only be helpful, but it's actually really pretty self-destructive because perfection doesn't exist. It's not attainable. It's not a goal to strive for. It's just this addictive belief that if you do everything in your power to look perfect, to act perfect, that you can avoid all the pain and heartache and shame and judgment and blame that comes from being human and existing in this world. So when we experience those painful feelings that we're trying to avoid, we only just further perpetuate shame and blame, because if a desirable outcome doesn't occur, we attribute it to the belief that we just weren't good enough, and so the cycle continues. So in discovering all of that, I went on a little search, a little bit of a rabbit hole of how can I break this cycle. And one of those ways was finding this helpful anecdote about question framing. So for example, instead of asking yourself, what would it take to consider this perfect? Ask yourself, what would it take to consider it done? Perfect is subjective, done is objective. So if you focus on the scope of work instead of the perceived quality of the work, that helps you to actually motivate yourself to get things finished. Oftentimes perfectionism, I know for me, gets me so tied up in my own head that it, like I said, prevents me from starting anything. But I think we need to realize that nothing will ever be perfect. The most important thing is that you've done your best and that you've accomplished what you set out to do. It's not a life or death situation, especially when it comes to creativity. Creativity should be fun, and you should be leaning into exploration and not perfection, because that's where the learning and the growth comes from. So moving forward, especially in creative journeys, I'm just gonna start, knowing that the road will not lead to perfection, because again, it doesn't exist, but it will lead to a sense of accomplishment, and I think that's the most important thing. So, going back to life's general busyness, part of that busyness has been 2 moves within the past year. And in fact, I've been a bit of a chronic mover since 2016. I've moved 6 to 7 times since 2016. Some of those have been within the same state. One of those moves was a move from Pennsylvania to New England, and then another one of those moves was from New England back to Pennsylvania, all of which were extremely stressful. I think one of the reasons perhaps that was more subconscious for moving was feeling out of place, especially living in a country that I don't feel represents myself or my values. I think that American culture has this sense of toxic individualism, and it's just this overall feeling of deep-seated egotism and self-interest and lack of empathy, because at its very foundation, America has this self-made myth, you know, the old pick yourself up by your bootstraps broken record saying. And in reality, America prioritizes profits over people. There's this culture of consumerism. The food is garbage, and we don't value tight-knit communities where towns and places are easily walkable and safe and sidewalks aren't a thing, and it's just not fitting to how I would like to live my life. And I feel like that's a huge reason why I've just felt out of place in most places that I've lived. But as I mentioned, like life loves to do, an unforeseen circumstance was thrown our way, and we've found ourselves in a position where we've needed to move again. And as we all know, moving is one of the most stressful things that you could possibly undergo. So this time, when we decided to move, I knew that I wanted to be here for at least a little while. And in order to make myself feel a little bit more at home as much as I could, I decided to buy this book called This Is Where You Belong, Finding Home Wherever You Are by Melody Warnick. And after reading it, one of the interesting things that I had found was that Americans have long been among the world's most consistently mobile people. Each year, around 12% of us move, but in countries like Germany and China, only 5% of the population have moved in the past 5 years, whereas in the US, 35% of us have. And you would think that one of the main reasons why people move is because of a job. I know that for myself, almost all of the reasons why I've moved have been job related. But actually, when people were surveyed here in America, they had found that people reported place matters more than a paycheck. But I also think that we can't separate a place from a paycheck, because I think a lot of what determines where you live, what determines your place, is your paycheck. And a prime example is a story in the book that the author tells of a woman named Gertie who lives in small town Appalachia. She was born and bred there in neighboring West Virginia. In the story, the author recounts the tragedy that happened in this coal mining town where a coal slurry dam collapsed at the top of the valley, and these treacherous, black, viscous waters were basically unleashed on this town below. And so the author goes on to wonder why Gertie hasn't left. I think a large part is because she was born and raised there, her family and friends are there, her grandkids. But I think another part of things is because a lot of that area is socioeconomically depressed and a lot of people can't leave. And the author doesn't see it that way. The author just says, because this is where she belongs, which I think that is taking a rather romantic approach. And while that may be partially true, I think another huge part of it is a paycheck, because moving is expensive. It can be anywhere from $500 to $5,000 or more, depending on where you're living and where you're moving to and how many resources you need to do so. I think while the book does have a bit of romanticism about it, there are a lot of good takeaways from it in relation to loving where you live. And a lot of those things are placemaking activities, because when people help create their place, they see themselves reflected in it, and it reflects their values and personalities and sort of becomes more of an extension of themselves. So the author essentially goes on to say that our actions can shape our emotions, and by performing behaviors that had been linked to place attachment, even without it being a love at first sight attraction, we could proactively make ourselves love where we live. So while the author does mention pretty obvious things as placemaking type behaviors, such as walking more, exploring nature, volunteering, eating local, getting to know your neighbors, and while most of these things seem pretty obvious, I think that there is a few positive key takeaways that I've drawn from to implement in my own placemaking behaviors and placemaking attachment style, especially because I was going from a living situation where I had experienced living in a home for the first time since moving out of my parents' house, where it was a standalone house, it had a yard, there was some privacy, I had a garage. It was something that I wasn't used to in my adult life, and then living there for a year and then having to switch back to living in a more shared communal space. So it was a bit of a mindset shift, but I truly think this book helped me see the obvious things and actually take them into account as important. So the things that I've personally adopted so far have been exploring more local adventures and drives and walking local trails, and actually even getting involved in a nearby exercise class to get to know relatively more local people. Thankfully, the area where I live now is not too far from where I've grown up, so I have friends and family in the general area, but I think as a chronic mover, I really wanted to feel more well-rounded as a community member. And maybe not put down roots, so to speak, but at least feel more planted and secure in my current living situation. And like I said before, moving is stressful. It's one of the most stressful things you can possibly undergo, especially if it's more of a reluctant move. In my case, as I mentioned, I was in a situation where I was renting a full standalone home for a year, but with rent increases, it no longer made sense for us to stay. So this move was more of a feet-dragging reality check where downsizing, budgeting, and coming to terms with leaning more into savings as much as we could was more so the primary objective. And thankfully, we had ample time to prepare, but the longer I dwelled in the space, the more the move was looming overhead. So I had a real conversation with myself that I didn't want the last month or so of living in this place to be mourning that I wouldn't be living here anymore. It was time to really relish the space and enjoy as many moments as I could until I had to leave. So I made a promise to myself that I would treat this move differently, and while not everything went perfectly, there were a few things that I found I did right, and of course ones that I did wrong. So the first thing that I think went right was that I reframed my thinking. Instead of it being a negative thing, I thought of it as a chance to start over and look forward to something new. I realized I would be closer to a town with easy access to fitness classes, a coffee shop, vintage and antique stores, great restaurants, and I found that that really got me in the spirit of looking forward to moving to a new place. The second thing that I think I did right was really soaking in those moments within the last month or so in the home before I had to leave. So I had slow mornings making coffee, and I would take it outside and enjoy sitting on the patio, listening to the birds, listening to the cows, watching my corn fence. I watched the seasons shift from summer to autumn, and I made the most of having a yard and having a patio by having campfires and s'mores and putting up patio lights and just overall enjoying the space and enjoying living there in the last few weeks that I could. The next thing that I think I did right was by making packing time intentional, by making it as stress-free as possible in order to trick my brain into it being a positive experience. So I lit candles, I put on my favorite music and my favorite records, I opened the windows for some fresh air, all in order to trick my brain into this being a positive moment rather than a negative emotional experience. The next thing that I think I did right was that I started packing immediately once I knew I was moving. We had ample time to prepare. I started packing right when I knew I was moving, and I made sure to pack by priority of things that we used least to most. So all of the decor came off the walls, all of the decor came off the shelves, everything was packed that we weren't immediately using, and we just prioritized from there. The next thing that I think I did right, sort of, was the packing and unpacking process. When I started packing, I labeled boxes in detail so that when I unpacked, I could separate and sort things into categories. The reason being is because my intention when I moved into the new space was to redo each room as a place attachment behavior and to feel more like this is my home. Because at my previous rental, I couldn't make any changes with the old rental home because weirdly enough, it was a home owned by a family who was using a property management company because they were living in another state for a few years and then planning on returning back home in about 2 years, so I didn't want to alter anything because of it being a family home. Whereas this move is an actual rental unit where I can make changes like painting and doing renter-friendly adjustments. So I wanted to treat our garage, at least for now, like my own little shop from home store that I can access when redoing each room, where I can go down and shop, so to speak, from the store and decorate each room, because not only would it be a waste of time to put stuff up on the walls knowing that I'm going to be redoing everything, but I found that my brain can't really function with putting things up and finding places for things and then having to take them down and shuffle them around. So I very much wanted to be systematic and go one room at a time. So moving on to the things that I would do differently, these two things kind of go hand in hand, but basically they would be decluttering prior to packing and prioritizing organization. I think that there were a lot of things that both myself and my partner had accumulated in the various different moves that we had undergone that we never really dealt with and kind of shoved in boxes or shoved to the side. There was organization things that didn't occur and didn't take place that I think could have made the process much more seamless. For example, lots of stationery and important documents and kind of office desk type items were completely messy and unorganized and just shoved into boxes, and a lot of garage things were kind of all over the place. In fact, we had boxes in our garage at the old rental home that were never even unpacked from the previous move. So there were a lot of things that I think we were holding on to that we either just never had a chance to deal with or maybe were procrastinating on dealing with. So this time around, we prioritized. Once we unpacked all of the boxes at this new rental unit, I decided to organize things, put things into categories. I got a label maker and separate bins to put stationery and greeting cards and creative things, and basically just created an organization system in order to easily access things, find things, know where things are, with the hopes that for the next move, it will make our lives much more easier. Another thing that I think I did right was setting aside time to enjoy myself and get my mind off of moving. I was able to spend some time with friends, cooking them dinners, meeting new babies, and enjoying autumn with an impromptu trip to a pumpkin patch with a friend for photos and pumpkin picking. Because if you entrench yourself in only the hard stuff, it really starts to wear you down. So making time for the people and the things that you love will give you a boost in mood and make it easier to get into focus mode when it's time to pack. So this video is definitely a bit of a longer one because I've just had a lot on my mind recently, and I definitely don't claim to have all of the right answers, but these are just the observations and things that I've noted through this season of my life, and hopefully by sharing my experiences, I've maybe helped someone who is watching this and going through a similar circumstance. There's no doubt about it, life can get hard and feel confusing, and sometimes things that are happening don't really make sense when you're in it. And there will certainly be times where you feel like giving up because the stress is too much. But just remember, sometimes carrying on, just carrying on, is the superhuman achievement. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you feel so inclined and you like my content, it would mean the world for you to like and subscribe. If not, no worries, I'll see you in the next one and we'll talk soon.